Bez Hashem Yisbarach to be Mamshech, the pasuk Yud Beis over here in Sefer Yeshua. Parak Aleph pasuk Yud Beis. Velaraubni, velagadi, velachati shevet Hamnasha, Omar Yeshua Laemar. To shevet Reuven, and to shevet God, and to half a shevet Menashe, Yeshua said the following. Yeshua told them like this. So we spoke some Divrei Halacha, some lamdas from the Brisker Rav and from Reb David Rustam Maramokim. The Mesha Chachma also, we mentioned this, but it just, I'm not going to get into it, just Mesha Chachma over there in Parshas Matos explains a little bit also, that there was no Tanai for Shevet Menashe. I mean, it's pretty clear for the Chad Shevet Menashe. It's pretty clear in the Psukim, the way we read it, and it's pretty clear in the Rishonim like that, in the Achrayim, why they chose to pick on the Brisker Rav to ask this kasha. Doesn't seem like it's such a kasha. I mean, it's a question to ask, but it's not so shver. So I want to get into Shtickle de Reagod over here to talk about Bichlal, the Reuven, God, and Chatzi Shevet HaMenashe. So first, I want to just go through the Kliyakar, who we generally go through his Pirush on the Psukim, very much Al Derech HaPshat, and he says, Lo yiksiv leReuven v'lagad. It doesn't say Reuven v'Gad. Laamar al afshen esrachu me'eretz hakodesh lekachas nachla be'ev hayarden hu yisbarach le'richgam. He says, even though that they distanced themselves from the Eretz HaKodesh, from Eretz Yisrael, to take a nachla on the other side of the Yarden, on the other side of the Jordan River, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not merachik them. L'chein kosav la'Reuveni v'lagadi. That's why the pasuk says in a possessive eifin. The diktuk is possessive. Klemer Reuven shali, hu God shali. Kibanayhem, they're still my children, even if they're far away. They're still my children. Amnam kabe Menashe lehutzach lemer Menashi. But when it comes to Shevet Menashe, it doesn't say Chatzi Shevet HaMenashi. We explained why from the Malbim and Chumash explains why, but because it had nothing to do with him, the fact that he was split in half, and why he got the chelik and Eivar Yard and Chetze Ba'aretz, and half of his Shevet should end up in Eretz Yisrael. The idea is that he says the Shevet HaMenashe was the bridge that connected between the Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. And the girl fell on him to divide it. He brings this from the Medrash Tillim, and he brings from Bereshis Rabbah, Peit Aleph Chav. Yosef garam l'shvatim shikru bigdeyam. Yosef caused the shvatim to rip their clothing when they sold him and when they met with him. Therefore, Yosef gets punished that his shevet split in two, and not only that, but Shevet Menashe, his son, the Bechar, gets split into two also. Chetze be'ev hayarden v'chetze ba'aretz. And it's just interesting that we don't find this by other shvatim, that they get split in such an oifim, especially b'negeh and achla. You'll say Shevet Levi gets split into Kehanim and Leviim, but it's a different kind of split. It's not a split in the sense that they're two separate shvatim, although we do refer to it in Gemara as the Shevet HaKohuna and the Shevet HaLeviim many times, right? Just we know that from the Gemara in the Lamer Alf, there's just no such thing as a Shevet HaAniyim when it comes to Ma'aser. And even that's a Zaytik Shmuz. But the idea is that Shevet Levi didn't have an achla, and that's what we spoke. That's what the Brisker Rav was trying to explain, the difference why Shevet Levi could get a chelik of land over there by Bnei Gad and Reuven. He continues and he says the Derech Remez that there's a Yud by Reuven and God and a Hey by Menashe. Laamar she'af al pi shehem chutz lagvul. Even though they're outside Eretz Yisrael and they're chutz lakedusha, so to speak, im kol zayim kulam shiftei kat. All in all together, they're not rachok from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Al derech masha omru hachanoichi hapalui sheshayachim al kedusha, the famous Chazal that in Parshas Pinchas, when the Torah counseled the Shvatim and the children of the Shvatim, it says hachanoichi hapalui, and the understanding of that is, says the Medrash, is that there's a hey in the beginning of the name, which is from the Shem Hashem, and there's the Yud at the end of the name, and that's why they're called Shiftei Ka, that the Shem Ka surrounds them, so they're shaykh to the Kedusha, even though they're not in the Eretz HaKodesh Be'etzim, but we'll see later that they were Mekadosh very much, and really they were being meichen this area to be the Yerusha for Klal Yisrael at a later date, which we'll see in Mitzvah later, that the Ev HaYarden is the Chelik of the Keni, Knisi, and the Kadmaini, which in Mitzvah we'll see in the coming Shiur. And fine, but that's the thing. Now I want to go through what the Bnei Yisrael says also. Now it just sounds very Geshmaikavart what the Kulakar is saying, that doesn't matter the fact that they don't live in Eretz Yisrael, but because there's part of the Shiftei Ka, it doesn't say more than that. He said just the mere fact of them being part of the Shiftei Ka gives them that the Madrega that they're Shaykh to Kedusha. Meaning, even though they're not in Eretz Yisrael per se. I mean, we know the Gemara says in Brachas, "Dein la Kadosh Baruch Hu al Dalar Yom Shachar Beis Hamikdash, Dein la Kadosh Baruch Hu al Dalar Mishal Halacha B'Lvad." Right, to the point where the Paiskim want to say that we have a Mikdash Ma'at Hagam. It's not the real Beis Hamikdash, but where we have a Mikdash Ma'at, this Dalar Mishal Halacha wasn't destroyed. That Beis Hamikdash still exists. That Kedusha still exists. Whether that means that we have a Beis HaMedrash, whether that means we have a Beis HaKnesses, whether that means we have people learning in their homes, but that's all Dal Rama Shal Halacha, that's L'mayla Min HaChurban. And it's to the point that the Paiskim say that the Beis Medrash has a din of Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, has a din of Kedusha Samitish, B'negea Arla, B'negea all these things. It's Kedai to see Rabbi Yoina, the Chuvas Chasam Sefer, the Briskarav Bed also. But that's the concept, that's the idea of wherever Klal Yisrael goes, they take the Kedusha with them. When Klal Yisrael went down to Mitzrayim, so ultimately and eventually they got assimilated to Mitzrayim for the most part, but they still held on to the Kedusha. There's still some inherent Kedusha that was there. Now, even stronger than that, when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, they got the Torah, so now the assimilation is much more difficult because the Torah keeps us together. The Torah doesn't allow us to assimilate that much further. The whole reason why today we could walk around with non-Jewish name. Not that we should, but if we do, it's not that bad because we have the Torah that keeps us in check. It's good to see what the Bnei Yisrael says over here in Darchei Deisecha. It's a shtickle arichos, it's a shtickle tif. I'm not going to be able to explain it that well, but it's kedai to read it just to kedai to hear the words, to hear the concept of Bechlal, what's the business of Shevet Gad and Shevet Ruvain. So many times when we're going to get to what he says, we're going to be repeating the diukim that other people asked. And he says like this, it says HaMenashe Behei HaYediyah, and it says Lamar, which is not really directed at anybody. He says, he brings from the Arizal in Parashas Matas, that says that the reason why Ruvain, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe were outside of Eretz Yisrael, they were left out of the Kedusha. He says, because by all of them, when Ruvain was born, when Gad was born, and Chatzi Menashe, we'll see what that means when Chatzi Menashe was born, there was epis of Mashahu that wasn't 100% the way it should have been when they were born. It says, when Ruvain was born, Yaakov thought that it was Rachel, really it was Leah. And by God, he didn't know that it was Zilpah because he didn't talk to Leah about it before. And Yosef is a separate issue because Yosef married Osnas, who was a daughter of Dinah, who was from Shechem. So that's a whole different story. We know that Yosef is Kulei Kodesh, and that we know because we mentioned in the previous Yurim, the Madreg of Yosef, the Mid of Yosef HaTzadik, is the union of Shmiras HaKedusha by Klal Yisrael. So he's Kulei Kodesh. There's no Mokum Pikbook, there's no Pagam, there's nothing to talk about. Now, Osnas is an interesting issue because her mother is Jewish, but her father isn't. Her mother's Osnas, who's a daughter of Dinah, but Dinah was married to Shem. She was Nana Salidei Shem, which we spoke about in Parshas Vayishlach, we spoke about this on Chanukah. That the idea is that Osnas is Chetzi B'Kedusha and Chetzi B'Chal, because her mother is Dinah and her father is Shem. So you have a quarter of Bnei Yosef that were stuck in Chutz La'aretz, which is Chatzi Shevet Menashe. You have Yosef split into Ephraim and Menashe. Half of Menashe gets stuck in Chutz La'aretz in Ev HaYarden. And what's interesting is that the Bnei Yisrael talks about it in other places also. and he references in the pasuk of by the Meraglim. It says Lamata Yosef Lamata Menashe. It's Misyaches Menashe to Yosef and not by Ephraim. And he brings that he brings this whole thing again, and he says that Yosef he just brings a lesson that Osnas was Chetzi Mikdushas Dina, V'Chetzi Mishchem Ha'oror, and Yosef was Kulei Kodesh. Now there was a quarter of Shevet Yosef, there was a Chashash Pagam. So that's why a quarter of the descendants of Yosef were stuck outside Israel. It's just very fascinating, this whole business, because about Yosef Befrat, because Yeshua comes from Shevet Ephraim, and he's from the other one. I mean, he's not from the Bechor of Yosef, he's from the second son of Yosef, but Afal Pikein, he's still the one that brings Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. It may be that Ephraim is, so to speak, covering up for this issue of Menashe, but we'll see. And there was a specific shlichus that Yeshua went to Eretz Yisrael with the Meraglim, and that's why he needed that specific yichus. And he says L'bnei Yosef, L'bnei Ephraim, and it doesn't say that because over there was talking about the yichus in Parshas Bamidbar, because Ephraim is Kulam Misyachas Yosef Mashen Ke Menashe. Fine. So he continues and he says like this: Bnei Menashe on their own did not know which ones were Bechinas Chutz and which ones were Bechinas Pnim. Dahainu, they did not know which ones were born from the ones that had an issue and which ones didn't have an issue. It was only known to Moshe with Ruach HaKodesh. Even though Bnei Menashe Bechal didn't come over to Moshe. It's just interesting that he's saying this also. We mentioned this in the Brisker of that Bnei Menashe didn't come to Moshe with any kind of taina that they should give them Eretz Hagila. Just Moshe Rabbeinu Subrach Kachay, which chelik of Bnei Menashe was shaykh to Eva Yarden, and he gave it to them. Meaning that they fought that war, and I guess through that Mulchama, the way that they were fighting it, the way that they conquered, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see which ones Baruch Kachay how to deal with it. So Moshe Rabbeinu commanded them that they should cross over Chalutzim, and Menashe wasn't part of this, meaning Menashe wasn't part of it tonight. Moshe Rabbeinu gave it on his own volition, he gave it over to them. But it's understood from what Moshe Rabbeinu told them, that when he says, why does the Pasuk have to say that? The Pasuk could have just started from Lama Siniyun, which we mentioned in the previous year. And he says, Nachdem is another kasha. Because if the Kpeidan, Bnei Gad and Reuven was that you shouldn't just leave Klal Yisrael there on their own, what's this that Moshe is telling them? That if it's not a punishment. They're going to get Eretz Yisrael. So what's the issue here, B'chlal? A very interesting thing. We sort of touched on this in the previous year, but let's just speak this out. Let's just speak this out one more thing. Derech Klal will say, if you clean up your room, you could get ice cream. If you don't clean up your room, you won't get ice cream. But by Bnei Gad and Reuven, he tells them like this: if you fight the war, then you'll get your chelik outside Eretz Yisrael. But if you don't fight the war, then you will get your chelik in Eretz Yisrael. Why is that a punishment? If I care, it's a schar. It's a good thing. So the Bnei Sascha says that there's another kpeda here besides the kpeda that we're talking about, because they could have timed it that the reason why we don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael is because we don't want to have to deal with the Mulchama. Which is still interesting because the Lamaisa they already. I mean, maybe it's good for the pshat because they already fought the war. But we find by the Bnei Menashe that they conquered Eretz Hagilad over there. Now maybe the reason why they didn't want to come into Eretz Yisrael, they could have timed it that they didn't want to come into Eretz Yisrael is because they already fought enough and they felt like they didn't have to fight to go into Eretz Yisrael. Which is shver to be nasig because we know that there's the second to Dor Deya, where the Dor Boya Oretz was a tremendous madrega, second to the Dor Deya. So what's bechlal the shaila here that they wouldn't want to go to Eretz Yisrael. So the reason is that if they'll say that they don't want to fight and they want to stay in Evar Yarden, so there's a chash that the Shvatim will start talking negative about them, and they're going to say, oh, you know why they don't want to go into Israel is because they're pogum. There's something wrong with them. So therefore, Hashem made it that that the entire Klal Yisrael should go fight the war, that nobody should be able to see this b'shas ma'isa, and that's why Moshe said to them, And Hachecha means that they were all brothers rolling this together. The Hainu, that there were those that may have had a Pagam, meaning they're later, like we said from the Arizal. But it doesn't mean that when we're coming into Eretz Yisrael that this Pagam should make it any kind of a difference. And he says a lashon haloihema achechem kamayim. We're all brothers similar. Kamayim kamayim. Us just like you, kulam kedoshim. V'atem teshuv pai. Meaning because they could have said, well, listen, I don't want to fight. Why should I fight with them? They're not my brothers. They're pogrom. They're this. They're that. They're not in a madrega. So there's a chash to say that they're not their brothers, because maybe you're not from Kaddish. Maybe you're more shaykh to the Indian of Chal. And that's one reason, he says. And there's another reason, Lamos and why should it be that that you shouldn't have to fight at all? That's why he says, and he's medayik in the psukim over there. It's not really negay for our shmuz, but he says it doesn't say Lamos and it says Vilamos and why is there extra vav? Because this extra vav is telling us it's a teisefes tam. It's not a reason why they have to go. Which sort of shtims. I mean, if you read between the lines here, maybe he's saying that there's an akud over here that even though Be'etzem, they weren't part of the Tanai, but they were part of the Tzivui. Maybe that's what he's referring to over here. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu says that if you're not going to cross over the Yarden and you're going to be oiches, you're going to have to be together with the rest of the Shvatim in Eretz Yisrael. Because if you're not going to go over the Yarden, then then you're going to have to get a cheluk in Eretz Yisrael. So if the whole idea is that there shouldn't be any chash of pagam over here, so then you're muchrachim atam litel hem dafka achuz b'seicha oretz b'ktei shel yechshav alei machshavas kol sagami, because if they don't go to fight and they don't have anything to do with it bichlal, so then the word is that they don't have anything to do with Klal Yisrael. You don't have anything to do with Klal Yisrael, then your sons are dropping out of the race. So that's altogether not going to be good for Klal Yisrael. And then he says a lashon. He brings a pasuk in Cheskel for this. He says a lashon that it's mebichinas b'nei tmura, chas v'shalom, and it's going to be b'chlal this pasuk. V'roisi mikam hamor d'vapeshu b'meretz v'gurei ha'maytzi yosam v'la'ad mas Yisrael la'yavav yidatu kina Hashem. That those that are married and Paishim be and HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want them in Eretz Yisrael. But that's not true with these people, because we said they're kulam kedoshim. There's no chash over here. There's no kam, even if something did happen a while back. But we want all of Klal Yisrael to go fight for Eretz Yisrael now, all as one, and to be able to be Yerush all of Eretz Yisrael as one, even the chelik that's in Chutz Aretz. So even though we have Chatzi Shevet to Menashe, that's not shaykh to Lamos Siniyun. Why to the time of Lamos Siniyun? Why? Because they never asked for Moshe Rabbeinu to begin with. So they didn't want to mention anything about this. They just said, "Well, listen to what Moshe Rabbeinu says, and not to cause any issues." Meaning, that even though there's a chash to be chayshish that maybe they're pogum, but that's what he says. That's why it's a davar halamid me'in yonai. Meaning that's the pshat. That's the reason for the two pshatim that he's saying over here. And he says that's the pshat also in why it says Haruvedi v'Agadi. It says Ruvedi v'Agadi and Aheba Menashe and HaMenashe. And L'chatzi Shevet HaMenashe is with the Hei HaYediyah, because Moshe Rabbeinu knew which half of them was from Osnas, meaning half of the children that were born from Menashe were born from the Tzara Tumah, and he was able to differentiate Brach Kachai, who was from the Tzara Tumah and who not. So he's able to split it, that those that belonged to that were shaykh to that pagam, they were on the other side. So Omar Yeshua Lemar, he says, Yeshua said to Reuven and God, and this Amira should go to Chatzi Menashe also, because it will have one din. And it's as if the pasuk says, Velaraubni, velagadi, Omar Yeshua l'chatzi shevet Menashe Lemar. Interesting how he wants to read the pasuk this way, that he says to Reuven and God that this Amira, this idea should be nimshach also to Chatzi Shevet Menashe. Just it wasn't written like that. Which is interesting, because when Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to them also, like it doesn't mention anything about Chatzi Shevet Menashe until the very end, and like throws it in there like they're chagim, they fell in here, they like popped into the meeting, and then all of a sudden they're running away with everybody else's ideas, but it just says in the pasuk, he says like this, because it just says in the pasuk that Reuven and God were makabel on themselves to do what they were in the Stabim Mipi Moshe. And that's the Shem Menashe, even though they weren't mitzvah to do anything, I'll pay that, but because they get the nachla together, so they go together with that. And it's just very interesting that he brings that the reason why there's a ois yud over here for the Ruvaini and the Gadi, there's a ois yud because it's Mara Machshava, to be Mesagan, this, Machshava, which is Al Shem Da'asid, because really we said that which hopefully we'll get to in the next year, that the idea of the Eva Yarden is really to be Mara on the Asid. And that's what the Yud is. Oz Yoshir, like Rashi says by Oz Yoshir. And by the Shevet God, there's a chash of the Machshav of Yaakov, when Yaakov, when God was born. But the MS, they're Ksherim him. And he says that Avad Yaakov wasn't chaytiv here at all. And there's no questions on the Avis Bechlal. But there's an extra Yud over here to show that the Machshava was Kaidish. Now, he's saying Tifer. He's saying Tifer than what the Medrash says in Parshas Pinchas. Parshas Pinchas is being Yachis all the Shvatim and all the Mishpachas of all the Shvatim. That there was no Pagam in Klal Yisrael B'chlal. That was Mitas Shlema, and we could have stopped over there. But now he says that even with B'makam, where there was a Chash, a Pagam in the Machshav of Yaakov Avinu B'Shas, the late of Reuven and God, and Reuven and God, there was no Makam for that, and that's why they're singled out. Meaning, even though Be'etzem, they're still on the... Meaning, it's like this. So, if the word is that they're not Shaykh to Kedusha, why they... Meaning, if they're not Shaykh to Kedusha, then they're outside Eretz Yisrael. But if we're saying that there was no Pgam, so then why Taka aren't they invited into Eretz Yisrael? And that's what the Kasha was before. So if you don't go, then you're going to have to stay in Eretz Yisrael. What's that all about? But the word is that La'asad Lavai, when they're going to get to the Eretz of the Keni, Kniza, and the Kadmoni, that the Pshat is that it's going to be, that the Kedusha is going to take over, like the Psikta says, the Psikta, which we'll talk about next year also, Mitzvah, that there's an idea that the Kedusha of Yerushalayim is going to be Nispasha against Eretz Yisrael, and the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is going to be Nispasha throughout the entire world. And there's going to be tremendous Harchavas Gulei Kedusha. So then the ones who started with that are Reuven and Gad. And that's the pshat and why it's dafka with the Oiz Yud, is at the end of the name to be Moira on the Machshava, to be Moira on the Indian of the Asid, to be Masak in this Shtikal Upgam, but that's what's going to take it into the Asid. And the Oiz Hey by Menashe is coming to be Masakim for the Maisa of Shem, because the Oiz Hey, he says, is Moira la Maisa, and there's no additional Vav by his name, which Vav is generally Moira and Maisa, which is connected to Sheshes Mea Maisa. He says there's no. He's saying that the word is that there's no pgam from Shem, who's not from the Kedusha, but even though Shem was involved, he wasn't really pagam that bad. The Iker pagam was by Dina, but not more than that. That there was a Zuhama that was in Dina. Again, we said this is above what we could explain, but I'm just going to read the words. Again, he says that the Chash is from the Nekeva, from Osnas, which is, maybe we'll get to it. We have a shmuz about that by Rachel, but Mitzvah at the beginning of Parak Beis. And Yeshua was saying that the word is that Hagam, there was this Pagam, and Hagam did maybe a shot that the Clouders will look at them as if they were Pagam, but Chas v'Shalom, they're taking on the, meaning, it's like this. The word is like this. If there's a Makam for a Chash, then they wouldn't be the ones to lead the Mulchama, because this Mulchama is a Mulchama of total Kiddushim Shemayim doing Ratzon Hashem. If there's a Pgam, then these guys aren't going to be the one to do it. These people leading the Mulchama are the biggest Tzaddikim and the biggest Yerushalayim. As we know from the Gemara Saita, Misha Banabayis, he has to go back. And all these things, on and on. But that's the word of what we're talking about over here. With why, why Dafka these Shvatim. And it's interesting, it always bothered me, like, what did these Shvatim do that they didn't get Eretz Yisrael? So Mikna Rav, we said from Rabbeinu Mepshischa that they had a kinyan in Moshe Rabbeinu. They wanted to stay with Moshe Rabbeinu. the rest of Klal Yisrael didn't. There's a lot to talk over here. The Pelishit, I think we'll talk about it a lot, and I found some more, but in Mitzvah we'll get to it at a different time. Okay, fine. A few more points. The pasuk continues, and the pasuk says, "Omar Yeshua Lemar." So the Kliyokar explains that it was said al yidei shliach, and it wasn't directly to them. And he says maybe the shluchim were the Sheitri Ha'am that we spoke about earlier in the previous psukim, because that's Velaraubni, and it's that's how the pasuk starts. So Omar Yeshua al Sheitri Ha'am Lemar Shehim Yemru L'Reuveni Velagadi Zechar, which is the next pasuk. And he didn't say this himself to give it over to them, which we spoke from the Alshich. The reason for that was to keep things calm, not to get people nervous, not to get people too excited or worked up before the Mulchama, that they should go into Yisrael Yishuv Adas. And that's what he says, it doesn't need to rely on them or their Gvura. They're not going to Yarsh and Eretz Yisrael with the sword. He didn't tell them anything about this. He was just reminding them to make sure they keep their word. This what you got to do when you go into, specifically when you're going into Makom Kadosh, you have to take care of that. So the idea wasn't to Shtalavek making a whole serious meeting. This is what we got to do. This wasn't the general prepping the Eilim for the Mulchama. This is just, by the way, you said something, you promised something, you got to keep your word. So that's why he did a Kalachayad. The Shliach wasn't something so specific. And we mentioned in the previous shir that the Malbim says that Yeshua, that this was the very, very beginning, and Yeshua was nervous, and so that's why he had to talk to Bnei Gad and Reuven to tell them, hey, listen, you got to fight. Kafi ha'omer, the way that we're understanding that from the Alshich, really, that the concept of what Yeshua was doing, giving this talk to Bnei Gad and Reuven, was very much al derech, the pshat that to calm everybody down, and that people shouldn't get excited, that people shouldn't be nervous. So when it says that Yeshua was getting nervous, the way to understand the Malbim is that it doesn't mean that he was getting nervous. He was just nervous about everybody else getting nervous. So he just wanted to make sure that he would be there to be able to calm everybody down. And Yeshua says, "B'lashon darech eretz, eini kemazir ela kemazkir." I'm not coming to warn you. I'm just coming to remind you, to mention to you, she'en mazhirim l'nazarim kachem. You're the people that are Zahir. We know you're trustworthy, you're reliable. You gave your promise to Moshe Rabbeinu. Just reminding you, he's not being tevei them, he's just telling them. I'm not warning you. Because Moshe ben Hashem commanded you. And I'm just the Mazkir of Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm just reminding you. I'm just telling you that you have to keep your word. And really, the MS, Moshe Rabbeinu was Mazaris them that they should. So here's where things get a little interesting. This is from the Kliyokar, just to be mamshech a little bit, that Yeshua was telling them that you gave your word to Moshe Rabbeinu, and I'm just going to read what he says. Lafisha Moshe Rabbeinu ziriz aisam sheyaskiru shem shemayim tamid. Moshe Rabbeinu was Mazaris them that they should constantly be speaking and mentioning Shem Shemayim. Because that's what's going to give you koyach in the battle. And I guess it brings in the Ben Ezra, like it says in the pasuk, "Vanan Hashem lefnei Hashem kasher adoni dover u'mazkir Shem Shemayim." That you can't say talking about Hashem. So Yeshua is saying Moshe Eved Hashem. So he says v'divrei harav zal oven mashakasav kan oimroi asher tziva escha Moshe Eved Hashem leimor. And he says from this that the Ben Ezra says that he was mentioning the Shem Shemayim Tamid. He understands why it says Asher Tziva Escha Moshe Eved Hashem. Why? Shetomru b'pichem sheshem lekeichem aniach lechem lebekeichachem. That we're constantly mentioning Shem Shemayim, so then you realize that everything is coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not from your power and your own strength. V'nasal lechem ha'aretz, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving you Eretz Yisrael. Shebzeh yechazik levavchem leleches lefnei acheichem ad asher aniach lehem Hashem yisbarach kechem shakol meitay. With this, you'll be able to be mechazik in your hearts and in your minds to be able to fight the war. And that's what he's telling them specifically. You are the ones that have to constantly be masker Shem Shemayim in your mouth. Because Shem Shemayim on your lips, because you're the ones that are leading your brothers into this battle. And you're going to help. And the idea is that really Bereshis b'Shvil Yishel Shenik Bereshis Shilayim Rumas Eilam. That they want to get Eretz Yisrael. The topics of everything was for right now that the Yidden should get into Eretz Yisrael. Well, and then he says, and it's the proper thing to do to always mention and to always say constantly that everything is Bidei Shemayim. So I was thinking about this, and I thought it was very interesting. Where does this come in Bechlal? And also that's why it says Ruveni Velagadi that we're mentioning the Shem Shemayim, the Shem, the Ois Yud and the Ois Hey that are surrounding the Shem Ois of the Shvatim here. So I want to talk about this a little bit and how this would help them get into Eretz Yisrael. Pasuk Shteit, beginning of Parshas Vayikra Adam Ki Akar Mikam, a person is going to go and be makar of a carbon. So the Gemara says in the Dorim on Davyud that a person should say carbon Lashem and not Lashem carbon. Why? Because maybe he's going to die right after he says the Shem Shemayim, and it's come to us that he's Mechal Shem Shemayim. In fact, the Chiddushei Harim, so then has a shayach for a person to tell his friends, Shalom Aleichem. The Gemara says in Shabbos and the Vidim and Beis that Shalom is one of the Shemis of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with Shmai Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you have to be chayshish that maybe he won't be able to finish his words and he'll just say Shalom and then he's going to die and then he just said Shem Shemayim for no reason. So then what's the pshat? So how does that work? See, he says, it's not Shvar. Why? Because you have a Gemara Brachas Vavam and Beis that says, Hamakim Shalom L'Chaveirei. I don't think that's the exact lashon of Gemara, but Akapanim, there's a concept here in the Gemara that a person should always be makdim shalom to his friend, and with that a person will have a richas yamim. So then you don't have to be chayshish that a person's gonna die right when he says shalom aleichem. Okay, and it's just very interesting because there's a ganza arichas in the Gemara and the brachas with Boyaz. And he says Hashem Yimachem, and they said Yivarecha Hashem. Why? And it's the same idea that he was able to be Masker Shem Shemayim first. We spoke about this Chanukah a few years ago, but this is the idea. Now, L'chara is very interesting that they should constantly be being Masker Shem Shemayim Tamid. That they should be reminding themselves that Hakol B'dei Shemayim. But I think there's a aymak over here because Eretz Yisrael is something that gives Arichas Yamim also. Like the Pasuk says, L'man yirbu yemeichem, v'imei v'neichem ala hadamar, shenishba Hashem, lo seis lahem, ki me'er shamayim ala. It's like the Gemara says in Brachas on Avches, ikasavi bebavel. Which is interesting, because that's like we were saying before. That goes back to Dafka, ikasavi bebavel, is when Klal Yisrael's not in Eretz Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael's in Galus. Klal Yisrael's not in the place where they should be. But that's what the Gemara says, that Afal Pikein, they're still doing the right thing. And the fact that they're doing the right thing, it doesn't matter where exactly they are. Amru l'Rabbi Yochanan. They said to Rabbi Yochanan, Ikasavi b'Bavel, are there older people in Bavel? Tamav Amar, he wondered and he said, L'man yirbu yemeichav yemei v'neicham alo adam aksiv. Avol chutz arzlai. It says that the people have a Arichas Yamim, meaning that they don't grow old in Bavel, because there's a Arichas Yamim specifically in Eretz Yisrael. Kevu be'amri. But once they said to him, they wake up early and they stay late in shuls. And this is why they have Arichas Yamim, because they wake up early and they stay late in shul. Like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi told his sons. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi told his sons that you should go to the shul as early as you can, and you should leave shul as late as you can. Today that you should have Arichas Yamim, that you should have Arichas Yamim. So even if your shul is in Bavel, or your shul is in some island off the coast of Florida, it doesn't matter. You have Arichas Yamim over there because you're going to a shul. You're involving yourself in a Mikdash Ma'at, and that gives you this school of Arichas Yamim. But we have some very interesting Zachin over here because the Gemara says in Megillah, and Dav Gimel, the pasuk in Sefer Yeshua at the end of Parak Dalet, I believe it is. Vayihi v'yesh Yeshua b'Yerichai. Yeshua was in Yerichai. Vayisa Einov, and he's in the middle of the Milchama with Yerichai, and he lifts up his eyes. Vayar v'nei Yeshem l'negda, and he sees somebody standing opposite him. Vayishtachu, he bows down to him. In fact, the Gemara v'Echi Avdach, how could he do this? From Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, also l'Adam shitin shalom l'chaver b'layla chashin and shem b'sheidu. He says, how do you know that you're allowed to say shalom to the person? You're not allowed to give shalom to somebody at night that you don't recognize because maybe he's a shade, maybe he's not really your friend. The Zakti Gemara, Shani Hosam, the Omalek, and he starts with Hashem. Who? He says, because he told him, I am the Sartzava Hashem. This is frankly Gemara of a Dumla Meshakri. Maybe he's lying. How do you know that he's telling the truth? So the Gemara, we have a Masar, we have a Kabbalah that a shade is not Moiti Shem Shemaim Levatala. Again, the Indian of being Maski Shem Shemaim and the Mulchama. When it comes to Moshe Rabbeinu being Mechazik Klal Yisrael to be Maski Shem Shemaim Tamid, like we said, there's a Shaila only on the Malach and not on Yeshua, like we find by Boaz. There's a Shaila about Boaz. But the Pasuk says, Kol Malkam Asher Azkir Shmi Avei Lecha Berech Ticha. And in Paiskim it's before like this, that when a person is learning Torah, and you come across a pasuk in the Gemara, you're supposed to say the Shem Shemaim, you're supposed to say the Shem Hashem. And the Yavitz writes in the Shuvah that when he was learning with his father, the Chacham Tzvi Hayo Goyer Boy, the Chacham Tzvi would yell at him if you wouldn't say the Shem Hashem. So there's an Indian, specifically when you're learning, to be Masker Shem Hashem. But when the Malach came to be Ma'achiach Yeshua because he was Mevatel Torah, so then it's not Min Haroi to be Masker Shem Shemaim. It's one thing because if it's coming Taich to Limud, but if it's not Taich to Limud, then you shouldn't be Masker Shem Shemaim. Now, we're going to speak later that the Milchama that they were fighting was Milcham Tishal Torah, and the only way that they were able to fight the war was because of this Milcham Tishal Torah, and that's why they should have been Masker Shem Shemaim. So that's really what the Malach was coming to be to time on Yeshua. But it could be that they held that Eretz Yisrael is that place, like the pasuk says, that Kol Makam Asher Azkir Shmi, right? So Kol Makam Asher Azkir Shmi, any place that you're going to mention my name, Zakta Kodesh Baruch Hu, that's even in a place when you're not necessarily being Isaac B'Torah. I mean, as we spoke, that the kedusha of those the Shlosh Meis Halach Shal Shachlu Glumei Evle Shalmaisha get orangaflans in the land, in the artsius of Eretz Yisrael. So even anywhere where you're going in Eretz Yisrael, but etzem the Shaykh to the Torah, but it's mavur in the Sifri, and it's a Gemara Saita that B'chol Makom Shani Nigla Alecha Sham Tehem Azkir Shmi, that any place where I'm megala myself to you, that's where you can be Mazkir Shem Shemayim. Ochen Ani Nigla Alecha B'Beis HaBchira. It's true that I'm megala myself to you in the Beis HaMikdash. Af'ata letazkir Shmi Ki B'Beis HaBchira. So too, you should only mention my name in the Beis HaMikdash. We can't Shem HaMefarish also Lamer B'Gvulim. This is where the Gemara learns out that even by Birkas Kehanim, but you only say the Shem Shemayim, the Shem HaMefarish in the outside Eretz Yisrael. Fine. But what's very interesting is like this. I want to make a shtickle drush over here. So first of all, Rav Shlomo Kluger has every sefer is a different parasha. So in Parashat Shlach Lecha, on the very beginning of the parasha, on the pasuk of Vayei Bracha, he's talking about Vayei Bracha, and he's trying to explain the pasuk, and he says like this: the Gemara Bracha says in Daf Nun Hey that HaKadosh Baruch Hu only gives chachma to somebody who already has chachma, because he says U'b'chol chacham d'chsiv U'b'chol chacham lev nasati chachma. That's the Gemara. That every wise person Hashem gave chachma. So he says, what's pshat? L'chayra einam moving. How could you understand this? The tchilas hachachma minayin. If a person has to have chachma in order to get chachma, how does he get his original chachma? Everything is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But he says the pshat is that there are people that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them directly, and there are people who HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them al yidei shliach. In order for you to be able to get from HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly, it's only a person who has chachma originally. But if a person who doesn't have chachma, then he'll only get it al yidei shliach. And once he gets it from a shliach, then he can get from HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly. Tchila noisen al yidei shliach, v'achar kach shekvar yesh lo chachma, noisen yisbarach ba'atzma. That's how he explains the Gemara, and he uses it to explain the pasuk. V'chen yesh leim bracha, and he says the same is true with the bracha. The ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu noisen bracha, elo l'mish yesh lekvar bracha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu only gives a bracha to somebody who already has a bracha. First, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives it to you al yidei shliach, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives it directly. And that's it. The pshat of the pasuk says, "V'avarechecha, v'agadol shmecha, v'hiyeh bracha." I will bench you. I will make you great. I will make your name great, and v'hiyeh bracha. What do you mean v'hiyeh bracha? You just said v'avarechecha. So he says that that's exactly the pshat of what we're talking about over here. First it says v'avarechecha, and then it says v'hiyeh bracha. Because this that it says ye bracha. First Avarechecha is going to be al yidei shliach, and then it's going to be from Hakadosh Baruch Hu Olay. And that's a pshat of the Targum of the pasuk. B'chol makom asher azkir shmi avei lecha v'rachticha. The Targum says, "B'chol asar the asher shchinti l'tamon ashalach b'choscha v'achinuch." Any place where you mention my name, I'm going to send my bracha there. First, I'm going to send it al yidei shliach, and then I'm going to give you a bracha myself. We spoke before, we mentioned a few shiurim ago, the Ramban, that says that the Ikar Makom Kima mitzvahs is in Eretz Yisrael. And this, that we do mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz, is kedei to be mechanech a person to do the mitzvahs the right way when he gets to Eretz Yisrael. So the same way when you have to get the original chachma, it has to be done with the shliach, and then you practice it, and then you go to Eretz Yisrael, and then you do it for real. That's the idea of Eretz Yisrael. It's just interesting because we said that there's a word here that Yeshua wasn't telling them directly, you have to be Ma'asker Shem Shemaim when you're fighting this Muhammad when you're going to Eretz Yisrael. He says al yidei shliach. What's al yidei shliach? That you don't have to. He didn't want everybody to get afraid, because when you're being Ma'asker Shem Shemaim, then there's no mokum to be afraid. Who's telling them? He's being Ma'asker them. He's reminding them what Moshe Rabbeinu said. He's the shliach, so to speak, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's the shliach of Moshe Rabbeinu to give them the real chachma, to give them the real bracha for when they come into Eretz Yisrael. So Semish state that and this is really going back to the original Varta de Kliokar, but it's more than that. So Samus in Parshas Balak says, Hakdusha nimshechet achar b'nei Yisrael b'chol malkim shehem. Kedusha gets drawn after b'nei Yisrael wherever they are. K'mayisha kosim b'chol malkim asher azkir shmi. Wherever you're going to mention my name. That's where it starts. B'chol malkim asher azkir shmi, that's where it starts. That's where the Kedusha starts. That's the Tchilas HaKedusha. Mela, Velagdi and Reuven, even though they're not in Eretz Yisrael be'etzem, but they can, we're going back there, so it's kind of just shant in the Agra the Pirke. It's a sefer for the Reis Yisrael, all kinds of very, very interesting Yisraelis and interesting Zachen in there. He says an interesting idea. He says the first time a person goes to Eretz Yisrael, he's not kainait. It's only when he goes back to Eretz Yisrael, that's when he's kainait. He says Avram Avinu was in Eretz Yisrael. He brings psukim from Avram Avinu. Let's just talk about it. But even on a bigger scale, because from the time when Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, Yaakov and the Shvatim went down to Mitzrayim, Klal Yisrael wasn't in Eretz Yisrael besides the little bit of time that they went to Ber Yaakov, and then they left, and then they weren't there until they're coming back now, B'mei Yeshua. So this is the Spitz Kinyan of Eretz Yisrael. This is where Eretz Yisrael is going to become a Kinyan to Klal Yisrael. This is the Hakadosh Baruch Hu fulfilling his promise to Klal Yisrael, as we spoke in the first year. But that's the pshat b'chol makom asher azkir shmi. V'hinei Eretz Yisrael l'beis hamikdash miyuchid b'kvius l'bnei Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael l'beis hamikdash miyuchid constantly for kvius, permanently by bnei Yisrael, and that's the pshat why it says Mishkan Eisecha Yisrael. That there's always going to be a Mishkan. There's always going to be a makom of Hashras Hashchina by Klal Yisrael. Afilu b'chol makom shebnei Yisrael shruim afilu b'derech harag sham nigla b'hem hakdusha. Even if they're in Golus, even if they're in a place where it's not mamish the makom hakdusha, but just the mere fact that you're not dwelling there, even if it's a makom arai, which the whole Golus is a whole thing of arai, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's megal himself to them over there. That's the Hashras Hashchina of there. Kanachaloni Torah, he says. Ki mayan ha-Torah, the spring of the Torah, nimshach b'chol makaymes meshvei. Wherever the Yidden are, that's where the Kedusha is. The Torah is there. The Torah is metayar them. The Torah is makadosh them. Doesn't matter where they are. They're there. That's where they have the Kedusha. It's very interesting because when Malchus Yavan came to Chapel the Yidden, they came to the Beis HaMikdash. Bo Pritza B'Chilalua, they're Mechal Shem Shemaim, they're Mechal the Mikdash, and they made many Gzeros on Klal Yisrael. They made 13 Gzeros on Klal Yisrael. One of the Gzeros that they made on Klal Yisrael was that they're not allowed to be Ma'asker Shem Shemaim. What do they have against being Ma'asker Shem Shemaim? Right? Because any place where you're able to be Ma'asker Shem Shemayim, you're being Ma'ir Hashras Hashchina of the Beis HaMikdash, like the Sasam is to say. Kol makom asher azkir shmi. Anytime you're mentioning Shem Shemayim, you're bringing Hashras Hashchina. The whole idea of Yavan was to come and uproot Kedusha. You can't have Kedusha here. I mean, Yavan is the antithesis to Kedusha. Chachma Avad you could have. But they didn't believe in Kedusha. So the fact that I could take a random spot of land and turn that into Eretz Yisrael, so then that's the worst thing that's misnaget to Yavan, because Yavan is the epicactus, and we say this by the parish of Yifastaya, that it says like Yisrael Macham Alavecha v'Yisrael B'Yeshis Yifastaya. So Rashi says v'Didei Dibra Torah El Keneged Yetzahara. V'Usep is that we have this whole parish of Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzahara, but the pshat is that when you're doing mitzvahs, when you're learning Torah, I mean, Yetzahara is not going to bother you so stark. But when you're coming to be marchev the Gvulas HaKdusha, when you're coming to expand the boundaries of Kedusha, the Yetzahara is going to do whatever it can to shter, because you're being marchev the Kedusha, you're minimizing the kaich of the kaiches atuma. So this is exactly with what Yeshua wanted to be mechazik Klal Yisrael with. That they should be mazkir Shem Shemayim Tamid, and they should constantly be being mentioned. That's why they're called Ruveni, the Hagadi, because they have the Shem Shemayim surrounding the names, like we explained before. But by Menashe not. Then we could say Pashat, L'chara Pashat. Why? Because Menashe is a son of Yosef, and he was protected, and he knew good and well about all these things. And so it's interesting that Menashe is a lashon of Nashani, Ki Nashani Elikim, that it's a lashon of Shikha. And his whole idea was, as a current, to not forget what happened. That's what Yosef called him that. And that's any place in the world where Yidden are, even if they're Rachik Me'er Kedusha, it's still shaykh to be Mamshach Kedushas Yisrael and Asheres Hashchin over there. And it's Kedai to end off just with the Medrash in Vayikra Rabbah, Aleph Zayin. Davar Acha, Vayikra El Moshe. It's going on the first pasuk in Sefer Vayikra. Pasuk says Vayikra El Moshe, Kodesh Baruch Hu called to Moshe Maksav L'Malam in Inyan. What did it say before then in the Torah? Parshas Mishkan. Mentions the Parsha of the Mishkan, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe. Like Hashem commanded Moshe. Moshe L'Melech Shasiva es Avda. It's a Moshe to a king who commanded a servant, V'amalei B'nei Paltin, build for me a palace. Al Kol Davar V'Davar She'yabayne Yekosav Lo Shmosh HaMelech. And everything that he would build, every pipe, every beam, every tile, every wire, he would write the name of the king on it. And he would build walls and would write the king's name on it. He would put up beams. He was putting up the ceilings and the roofs. And he was writing the king's name on it. The day came when the king came to check out what was going on. Everywhere where he looked, he saw the king's name on it. The king says that this whole great respect and honor that this Eved did, that my Eved did for me, I'm going to be inside this palace, and he's going to be a regular Eved. He's going to be outside. So the king calls him to come inside, meaning it doesn't just mean that he called him to visit him, and then he's going to throw him out in 3 seconds. He called him to live there and to be nana from it, and to be zeicha to this intimate experience that he's having with the king. Same is true that at the time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, Aseli Mishkan, Al kol davar v'davar she'yosei kaisav lo kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. Everything in the Torah was kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, zak HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kol hakavod hazeh sali Moshe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, all this great honor and this glory that Moshe Rabbeinu did for me. V'ani mi b'fnim v'hu mi b'chutz. I'm inside, being nana from this paltan that he built me, and he's outside. Karol she'yikanis l'fnai v'l'fnim. He therefore called him to go l'fnai v'l'fnim. Therefore it says V'yikra al Moshe, and he told him to come l'fnai v'l'fnim, kidei, that he should be nana from the covenant that he made for the king himself, that he should be nana from his own ma'aseh yadayim. And I think that that's very apropos to say about Yeshua also. Why does he keep on saying that Moshe is Eved Hashem? Kasher Tziva is Moshe Eved Hashem. It's the same idea, because everything Yeshua is doing is from Moshe. What's Moshe doing? Al Pi Hashem. Everything Kasher Tziva Hashem is Moshe. And there's no greater being called into the Paltan Shamelech than being able to be Machnes, the Klal Yisrael, into Eretz Yisrael. And with that, That's how Klal Yisrael is going to go into Eretz Yisrael, being led by the Reuveni and the Gadi. Ad Kan.